Hello, and welcome to an initiative dialogue on the Eucharist and Catholic faith, communion, and public life, voices in the United States, and a report from the Vatican. I want to wish you a happy All Saints' Day. In my parish, and apparently throughout the United States, excuse me, because it's on a Monday, we were not obliged to attend Mass today. So for those of you who are scrupulous, this counts as fulfilling your obligation. There's more than 1,700 people signed up. It's a holy day and a holiday in Rome, right, Chris? So for me, at least, it's appropriate we would gather on All Saints' Day because we're going to be talking about the Eucharist and how the Eucharist calls all of us to be saints in our own way, in our personal, professional, and public lives. For myself, I've always counted more on All Souls' Day. I figure I'm going to need lots of prayers to get me out of purgatory, but it's right that we would gather on All Saints. So it's a special day. It's also an anniversary. A year ago yesterday was the presidential election, and it's been a year. Another year of all the loss, human, economic, spiritual, from COVID, divisions in our country. Some people don't accept the election. We've had an attack on the Cardinal, on the Capitol. We've had migrants on our border. We've had the collapse of Afghanistan. We have paralysis in the Congress. Maybe that'll break. But we've had enormous polarization in our country and divisions in our church. This has been an odd year for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They seem to have been preoccupied by a debate over how to respond to the second Catholic president, Joe Biden, who says he draws strength from his Catholic faith in times of trial, says he draws direction from church teaching on the poor, but contradicts Catholic teaching and the commitment of our church to oppose abortion and defend unborn human life. And this discussion, literally from Inauguration Day till now, has been going on. 2 weeks from today, the bishops will gather in Baltimore to debate and decide on a document that has several purposes, but began with a call to Eucharistic coherence and, frankly, a campaign to deny communion to President Biden. It's shifted over time, but it's not clear where the bishops will come down. They will also launch, in a related way, a Eucharistic revival with major hopes and implications for our family and faith. While it may not be clear where the bishops are going to come down, it's pretty clear where Pope Francis comes down. As you all know, 3 days ago, President Biden and Pope Francis met for more than 90 minutes. They discussed care for the earth, they discussed the poor, they discussed COVID, they discussed religious freedom, they discussed migration. And then the president revealed when asked, they also discussed whether he should go to communion. And he said, Pope Francis said he should. To help us understand what has happened and what just happened, we're calling on Christopher White, who is our friend and the Vatican correspondent of NCR. He previously was the national affairs writer for NCR, previously worked for Crux, for Catholic Answers, and for other things. I guess it's been sort of an easy few days for you over in Rome. Nothing going on, only a papal visit, G20. What happened with the meeting with Biden? And then I'm going to ask you, because you covered what's been going on with the bishops. What happened and what didn't happen?
Thank you, John. And it's always good to be back at an initiative event, although I miss the in-person gatherings. I think by every account that's at least publicly available, this meeting on Friday between the Pope and the President was a success. I was in the courtyard when Biden arrived, along with his seemingly never-ending entourage of just scores and scores of vehicles. And he gets out of the beast, and he's immediately smiling and laughing and telling members of the papal household delegation that it's good to be back. And he introduced himself at some point as Jill's husband. And then he goes upstairs into the Apostolic Palace, and I think that the private portion of the meeting went on by somewhere between 75 to 90 minutes. And what many people really are saying is probably the longest time Pope Francis has met individually with any other world leader. So some real significance there. And we weren't allowed up there even for the beginning, for the handshake. But the video footage that was released afterwards showed the president praising the Pope as the most significant warrior for peace I've ever encountered. And then just last night, actually, at the end of the G20, the president gave a press conference, and he was asked about that. And he spoke for over 2 minutes, getting choked up, and he says, this Pope is everything I admire about Catholicism. And that's for him, it just was a very emotional meeting, it seemed. We had the White House readout and a communique from the Vatican after the event. And of course, these are fairly scripted, standard, sort of summaries of the meeting. Climate change really seemed to have topped the agenda. And I don't think there's any surprise about that, given the fact that, the president today is now in Glasgow for the UN Climate Summit. And Pope Francis, of course, has really championed this issue from day one of his papacy. They also talked about, the COVID pandemic, poverty, migrants and refugees, and of course, freedom of conscience, as you mentioned at the top. But the real sort of, newsmaker was, as you mentioned, it was this came a few hours later when the president was kind of giving, there was this photo spray at the, Chigi Palace with the Prime Minister of Italy, and of course, the reporters are shouting out questions, and he, was asked if they discussed abortion, and he said no, they did not. And then he just said, the Pope told me I was a good Catholic and I should keep receiving communion. So that's just sort of the broad sketch of how things went. But I think, the stage is set for a pretty interesting, possible showdown. We'll see in Baltimore in a few weeks.
Say more about that. You've been covering the bishops before you went to Rome. Where did this proposal come from? What happened in June, and where does it stand now? And do you have any sense of where it's going? The one thing before you leave the papal visit, you made a reference to the enormous motorcade that the president had. I couldn't help noticing that when the Pope left the palace, first of all, he doesn't live there. That's worth reminding people. And secondly, he climbed in the back seat of a Fiat. So they might have had some things in common, but not others. And I, for one, wish he had maybe he did challenge him on vaccines, challenged him on abortion, maybe challenged him on the Middle East. We don't know what happened, but it's no surprise if the Pope encouraged the president that he shared that with the world, given he's been told so many times what he should and shouldn't do. But where did this come from? Where is it now? And what do you think is likely to happen?
Well, I mean, I think, you're right, John. Both the Pope and the president are known for their sort of off-the-cuff, unscripted remarks. And so, as a reporter, I'm certainly grateful for that, actually, even though I'm sure the advisors of both men would prefer it to go a bit differently. In terms of where this all came from, I'm not going to give a full TikTok of every event over the last year. That would take more than the full hour, and I'll spare everyone chronicling every twist and turn because we have far more interesting people than myself to hear from. But let's go back. You mentioned that the election was just over a year ago. So at the virtual bishops meeting last November, which was about 2 weeks after the election, in the final minutes of it, Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles, he's the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, he announced, that he was forming a working group after having conversations from, several committee heads. And he said, we're going to have this working group to deal with the election of President Biden and the quote, complex and difficult or difficult and complex situation of the Catholic president who supports legal abortion. And that was it. It was almost like a mic drop moment at the end of the bishops' meeting, because we weren't really given any context as to, who all was on this committee that had been formed. Several months go by and either the mandate of the working group had been announced or its membership was unclear, and we were all asking questions. And then, we come to right at Inauguration Day in January. I believe it's, January 19th, the day before the inauguration, there was a memo that went out from Archbishop Gomez to all the bishops. And he said, we've met this working group on 2 occasions. And there will be 2 initiatives, if you will. I'm going to put out what's now an infamous Inauguration Day statement. It was about 1,200 words in length from Archbishop Gomez, where he says, I'm praying for the new president, and I think there's real issues that we agree on. But then he had some really, strong language in there saying that the president had promised to pursue, some policies that would advance moral evils. And really, the bulk of the letter or the statement was focused more on areas of disagreement than agreement. And it marked a real contrast to the statement that the Vatican had put out that day, just sort of focusing on, pursuing common policies, together. But then the second thing that was in that memo on January 19th, and I think this gets us to the heart of where we're at today, is he says that the working group has recommended that the conference develop a document on the importance of Eucharistic coherence or consistency. That was sort of the phrase he used, Eucharistic coherence or consistency, including the fact that, our relationship with Christ is not just a private matter. So that's sort of where this idea of this document, came from. And then, there's been a lot of backtracking in recent months saying this is not a document about, politicians or it's really just about the need for, reminding Catholics of the importance of the Eucharist. But, as an observer of this, it's hard not to see the sort of politics that's sort of baked into its DNA. So this summer, when the bishops met again virtually to move forward with drafting a document, that's sort of what much of the debate was about, whether or not they would move forward with doing this, and then whether or not it would have a specific, focus on Catholic politicians. And a lot of those speaking out in favor of the document said, oh, this has nothing to do about Catholic politicians. This is about our need for reclaiming the importance and, the essential nature of the Eucharist in our life as Catholics. But then a number of bishops also advocating said, no, this is about the fact that we have a Catholic president and Speaker of the House that disagree with us when it comes to abortion. So a lot of mixed messaging going on there. And I think, and in fact, actually the outline for that document, for that draft proposal, had a specific section on Catholic politicians. So I think it's unfair to say that this was not political in nature at all. So here we are, the bishops are meeting again in just 2 weeks' time. My understanding is that the current draft document does not sort of single out any sort of class or group of Catholics. And it seems to be drafted in a way in which it's aiming to reach consensus. My understanding is that they're going to, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to have executive session among the bishops on the Monday of the bishops' meeting rather than at the end of the week, so that they can kind of work and perhaps craft some sort of, real consensus and compromise. And I think there's a good chance that they will reach that. But I do think just monitoring Twitter, and I know Twitter is not real life, but it at least is an insight on it. Over the weekend, when you see the president talking about what the Pope said to him, a number of bishops are quite upset about that, and they don't mind speaking their mind on that. And so I think regardless of what sort of consensus around this document is forged, you're going to have some bishops taking to the floor of the Baltimore Marriott. And I think they're going to have some pretty strong words that they want to say that may, in fact, contradict what Pope Francis has said.
Thank you. That was very thorough. As somebody who worked at the Bishops' Conference, fascinating, but in some ways too narrow. I mean, the topic's too narrow. The discussion is too narrow. I watched the June meeting. It was bishops. I work for bishops. I admire bishops, but it was mostly old white men talking about what the Eucharist should mean in public life. And we said we should have a dialogue. We had a dialogue with that included Bishop Rhodes, the chairman of the committee, Cardinal Tobin, who opposed it, two women journalists who had different views. I weighed in, Kim moderated. We said we ought to have a discussion of missing voices. And we talked to somebody, a friend of ours, and he said, this is the problem. You think we're missing. We are here. We're just not being heard. And so we're delighted today to broaden the discussion, both about what we're focusing on and who is offering the reflections. And we're delighted to have three women. I'll introduce them more fully in a minute when I talk to each of them, but Gloria Purvis, who now, what's the name of that podcast? The Gloria Purvis podcast at America, a great champion of pro-life and racial justice. Professor Carmen Nanco Fernandez, who is a professor at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and is former chair of the Hispanic Theologians, got a fancy name that I'll get right later. And a friend of mine I've admired, Sister Mary Bader, who runs St. Anne's Infant Home that has worked in here in Washington for 160 years, offering help and hope to young women and their babies. So Gloria, let me begin with you. First of all, most people don't know you were a financial wizard before you were a big shot and a leader of our church. You worked in the finance industry for several years, and then I think your pro-life advocacy led to you becoming someone who helps lead our church. You're unique in our family of faith. You're a pro-life leader that pro-lifers loved, and then you started talking about racial justice, and some of them fell out of love with you. In fact, canceled your program or decided your voice was no longer needed on EWTN. You landed on your feet. You're now at America with the Gloria Purvis podcast. You don't have to get up so early in the morning. And you're the first inaugural pastoral fellow at the University of Notre Dame Office of Human Life and Dignity, which is part of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. I think our listeners have heard of Notre Dame. It's a small Midwestern college. I think they have a football team. So you have landed on your feet, but in some ways, at least for me, this has been a diversion. It's too much about a poll, too much about politics, not enough about the Eucharist, a lot about the president, a lot about bishops, not enough about the rest of us. I want to ask you, as sort of one of the sanity caucus in our church, how should the Eucharist shape us, call us, challenge us to live the church every day, to really recognize Jesus in the bread and wine, but also recognize Jesus in the unborn, the undocumented, the women who face a pregnancy alone, the elderly who face the end of their life alone, people on death row, those suffering from racism or religious persecution. How does the Eucharist call us to live the gospel every day?
Well, I think we need to step back and think about how we receive the Eucharist, and it's at the Holy Mass. And if we think about what happens at the Holy Mass and who's present, it's not just us. God is present fully, God, the entire celestial court. And everything that we do or say during the Mass has consequences. I mean, we stand before God himself and we say we believe. We stand before God himself, and during the penitential rite, we admit our faults. We admit our sinfulness. We have the liturgy. We do the prayers, the reading of scripture. Then we say the creed. And then we say one thing where we believe that Jesus Christ will come to judge the living and the dead. And I wonder how much we've forgotten that when we're so distracted by all these other things, that what is it that we are offering of ourselves to the Lord when we go to Mass, right? That's the question. What is my oblation? What is my offering to him when I go to receive the Eucharist? And if I haven't really put into practice what I have claimed to believe during the Holy Mass, what I've said in front of God and all the celestial court about what I believe, and then my life in some way doesn't show that that is what I believe. I mean, how have I served the poor? How have I comforted the sick, sheltered the homeless? How have I visited the sick and imprisoned? I mean, to really ask ourselves, how is this faith that I claim to believe demonstrated in my life? How do I treat people on social media? What do my tweets say? I remember one episode of my podcast, we just said, yes, God will judge you for your tweets. What am I choosing? How am I choosing to act toward the other human person that I encounter, that God has put in front of me? Do I choose to ignore them, abuse them, treat them like a beast rather than my brother? There are a lot of things that we need to, I think, examine within ourselves before we approach the Eucharistic table, as to say, what am I bringing with me? What am I offering to God? What is my own offering to him at the Eucharistic table? And in order to do that, to ask that question, I have to really examine my life. How do I treat everyone else? Not just in physical action, but like, what kind of words do I say? What kind of things do I put out that I type out into social media? How do I treat my brother and sister? Those I like, those I don't like. All of those things come to bear, I believe, in living out the Eucharist. And how can we really, as Catholics, disentangle ourselves from the vitriol that's pretty much out there in the secular press, or the vitriol that politics has brought into the United States, as of late? I mean, I'm not saying this is a new kind of vitriol, but it seems to really be ratcheted up within the church in a way that, at least in my lifetime, I had not seen previously. And these are the things that I think we really need to be focusing on, is our own internal disposition toward God and what we bring to the Eucharist, to the Eucharistic table ourselves during the Holy Mass.
Gloria, you always make us uncomfortable. I'm much more comfortable telling the bishops what they should do than examining what I ought to do. And you brought me back to basics. Nonetheless, I want to ask you what the bishops should do. What's your advice for them as they try and teach about that call in a diverse, divided church? How do we avoid those entanglements, those ideological temptations? We got some folks that simply ignore Biden's administration's policies that undermine protection for the unborn. You have talked about the way in which President Trump, his rhetoric, his policies contributed to racial injustice and division. How do we act like we belong to each other? We're one family of faith. Even the bishops seem to be at each other. How can we live out a Eucharistic life? And what advice do you have for them in this context?
Oh, yes. I would love to, not that they need reminding, but I know that for me, as I think about this, any of us that are caught in the snares of the devil, if you will, we don't need to be yanked out of the snare. That does more harm than help, right? I want to survive, being entrapped. I want to survive to be liberated by Jesus Christ. And the bishops have such an important role in that regard, to, with loving care, try to remove souls that are entrapped in these snares set by the devil. So I would ask them to have a fatherly heart toward all of us who are sinners, and to help us to fall more in love with Jesus Christ, so that we can be, like surgeons, being precisely removing that which harms us in a way that we can survive, in a way that we can still hold on to the faith, in a way that we recognize that we are not damaged beyond repair. And I'm also going to ask our bishops to really take on the role of fasting themselves and almsgiving, because this is quite a delicate work. And I also hope that they would respect their own prerogative as each individual bishop in their own diocese. I mean, I'm thinking about that as well. So I would say, remember the gentleness that is needed to help a soul survive getting out of a trap, and also to respect each other's prerogative. And back to what the Lord said in scripture, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving will be very helpful in this work.
Thank you. That's powerful. Professor Carmen, I said the circle has to be broadened. Theologians need to be heard in this process. You're a theologian, you teach, you write. As I said, you were head of the, let me get it right, Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians. You actually got their Distinguished Achievement in Theology Award. We did not know each other until I read a powerful essay you wrote on real presence in a time of ongoing pandemic, which sort of situated what we're talking about in what we're living with. Then I found out you also reflect a lot and care a lot about baseball. So we have other things in common. But one of the things that struck me is Kim, our co-director, always says context is critical. You have to think about who's speaking, who they're speaking to, when you say it, and how you say it. And it seems to me we're missing, the bishops may be missing some of the context. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. The human loss is still overwhelming. We're a church challenged by COVID and all its things, financial, moral, spiritual. We're even divided over vaccines and policies. Secondly, we're an incredibly diverse church. We may be the most diverse American institution. We're men and women, obviously. We're African-American, Latino, we're Anglo, Asian American, Native American. A lot of us are immigrants. Some of us got here recently. A lot of us, our families came a long time ago. Politically, we're all over the place: Democrat, Republican, independent, conservative, progressive, none of the above. Some of us are deeply committed, others are alienated. And then the third context is we're wounded. We've been through terrible scandal. So the credibility of the church and its leaders is tested. So how do we talk about real presence in a time not only of ongoing pandemic, but in a church of great diversity and in a wounded community of faith? What was your message in that article? What's your message now, not just for the bishops, for the rest of us in this context?
Thank you, John. Also would like to call attention to the fact that these days are also Los Días de los Muertos. In other words, a time when we, in Latino communities and Latin American communities and Mexican communities, we remember the dead in a series of days and in a series of ways. That is most appropriate in this COVID time. That continues because we haven't really dealt with grief. So when we talk about real presence, we have to talk about it against the context and the ways that we as church have failed in so many ways to recognize and respond actively to the real presence of Christ in our very many contexts, some of those very same contexts that Gloria mentioned as well. And I guess I'm not convinced that Eucharist is the conversation that's most needed in the USA Catholic Church at this exact moment. I think in a large part, it's due because there is no significant data that substantiates the claim. And because the decision has also come from the top down, and it was grounded in flawed data from the Pew study. So I guess I question why have the bishops decided?
Can you explain a little bit? Some of us know what you're talking about, others. What was the Pew finding that has been cited so often in this discussion?
Sure. The Pew study came out. It did a study of which there were only two questions really about Catholicism. One was worded as, did we believe in real presence as a symbol, or was real presence actual? And so the wording of the question was confusing because in many ways the proper answer was none of the above. And then the word transubstantiation came out in the report itself. So Pew basically used the word transubstantiation more times than even the Catechism does. And in 2019, I want to say it was in July of 2019, their final report comes out. And based on a small sampling of Roman Catholics, determined that somehow Roman Catholics did not understand the real presence. And that then set in motion one bishop who thought that this was, who then launched in a Twitter tirade about it, that this was disturbing at so many levels. And then 10 bishops got together. And then the next thing we have is a letter and a Eucharistic revival that sadly intersected and was exacerbated by both the pandemic and by the election of Joe Biden. So all of this sort of intersects in a moment. But to me, the most disturbing part of this is not about Eucharist, because I think it is important that we talk about Eucharist, but it's the way that the decision went down. The way that it appears to be out of step or just downright ignoring the clarion call right now from Rome, from Pope Francis, calling us to synodality. And synodality literally is a sharing of the road or a journeying together. It's about two of Francis's favorite themes, encounter and accompaniment. And so I guess what that requires is first very deep listening to determine what indeed is troubling us on the ground, what is weighing down la vida cotidiana, the daily lived experiences of the grassroots. And I guess I see that missing. We're talking about something that we have not been asked about, whether this is our most troubling concern at this moment.
One of the things I read, people like me talk superficially about diversity. And you described it as recognizing our multiple belongings is a lot deeper than the way I usually talk about it. And so if we think about what you described, the loss that we are feeling, the divisions in our church, the call of the gospel, recognizing Jesus in the poor and vulnerable and in the Eucharist, how should our multiple belongings, how should what we have in common and what we bring differently to this shape how we learn from each other and act together? Classic example, I'm talking about All Saints, and you talk about the way in which your community celebrates the passing of the dead over several days. I mean, it's just my challenge. My point is there are lots of things we bring to each other. How does multiple belongings, how does diversity shape how our church ought to teach and learn and live?
Well, I think the flip side of multiple belonging is multiple not fitting in too, and multiple exclusion. And we're at this point where we're having conversations about inclusions and exclusions. And in terms of diversity, I think one way is that our language has to change, because even in the best intended language, we keep using words that the church must reach out to the marginalized. Well, hola, the marginalized is the church. Diversity is the church. You know, Gloria, Sister Mary, and I are not the diversity of the church. We are the church. And at some fundamental level, we are not recognizing that. And I think that this notion of them begins with this idea that somehow the poor, the vulnerable are outside of the church, and it's only the good-hearted extensions of people like, well, people in dominance that therefore make this the act of charity that needs to happen. And quite frankly, we were all missing from the conversation about real presence, because the bishops, sadly, at times during the pandemic, seemed to miss the real presence of those who were dying in the parishes. I want to know, where's the census of our dead? Where are our priests? Where are our ministers who continued through it all? Pope Francis knew the names of the dead clergy in Italy. I've yet to see the list come out in the United States.
Sister Mary, I read a story of how you became a daughter of charity. There was an article, I'm sure it's simplified, but even as a little kid in the second grade, you saw some kids had a lot and other kids didn't have enough. and thought that wasn't right. You went to the university, Tufts. You got a degree at Catholic University. That's where Carmen went, and then got involved in Catholic education. Eventually, joining the Daughters of Charity. You became principal at Seton High School, just a mile from where I live, and then became the leader of St. Anne's Infant Home. And so, which for 160 years has been the gospel at work here in Washington. So much of this discussion has been about abortion and policy and the Supreme Court and legal and this, and very little, frankly, about who's touched directly by abortion, the unborn child most directly, but the women who face a pregnancy alone, the families that are touched by this. We thought we should talk to somebody who focuses on the people, not the politics of abortion, the realities, not the ideologies around deciding to bring a child into the world. Somebody who offers everyday help instead of just hosting a dialogue or talking like I do. So you're not a political leader or theologian. You work with women and children every day. Tell us just a little bit about St. Anne's. Tell us about the women and kids you help find some hope. And tell us how, frankly, the Eucharist calls us to join in that work in some way, some small way.
Well, thank you, John, for having me on your program and being part of this discussion. I must say, though, that I was never head of Elizabeth Seton High School over in the other part of town here. I was at another school, but that's neither here nor there. But credit is due to whoever was at the time. Sure, I'm very happy to talk about St. Anne's. And St. Anne's is a ministry of the Archdiocese of Washington. We're a corporation, but we were founded back in 1860. And as I think back to 1860, where we were founded, which was only a mere block and a half, I think, from the White House, just as the rumblings of the Civil War were starting, it's, as I think about it, a little daunting now to keep talking, given what's going on in our country. But with that said, we were started in response, or founded, when one of the priests in the diocese asked the Daughters of Charity to send 3 sisters to Washington to found an orphanage and a home for women who found themselves pregnant, probably unmarried, and definitely in some kind of crisis situation. So the sisters came, and the Daughters of Charity have been here since. The mission, though, today is not as an orphanage, and it is not necessarily as a maternity home, which is what we were also known as. But our mission remains the same in terms of addressing the needs of children and women who are in crisis, who are vulnerable for many different reasons. The families that we serve today, they are women who have been, who are homeless. They are women who are immigrants, refugees, a political refugee recently, women who have been abused, and children as well as those who have been trafficked and suffered all kinds of trauma. And that's what each of our families shares, 2 traits, which sadly are things we don't want to see: homelessness and trauma. And our work today is centered on providing supportive transitional housing. We say supportive because that means more than housing. We know that our families come to us homeless, but why are they homeless? How did they become homeless? The trauma speaks to the need to be able to provide clinical and social work services, to be able to provide therapy, counseling, case management, helping them in coming to a way of understanding what they've been through, helping them heal. And that's part of the journey that we accompany them on, as you said, Carmen. We're accompanying them on the journey to healing and strengthening of a family. We also have opportunities for them to receive education, life skills classes, very practical things such as financial literacy, nutrition, healthcare for children, as well as parenting classes. Many of our mothers sadly have not had that kind of background where they understand or they've had the experience of positive parenting. And in another need is employment, helping them find employment. Why are our families homeless? There's 1,000,001 reasons, but some of it is they themselves have not been able to finish education, and they have not been able to find meaningful employment that pays a living wage. So we have services in those two areas. And finally, we address the issue of childcare. We have the babies and we have the children, and the mothers are struggling to find a means of getting their education, taking care of their employment needs, trying to pay rent, and they have nowhere to place their children. So we provide childcare, an early Head Start program, and childcare for kids as young as 2 months old up to 5 years of age. And together, these wraparound services, we meet the individual needs of each of the families.
Sister, you're right. Yes, it's a comprehensive program. Help me with two questions. One, you're a daughter, Cherry, you're religious. Obviously, the gospel, the Eucharist, is at the center of your life. What about the rest of us? Beyond politics, beyond sort of listening and learning, how can we be helpful? And secondly, what are I assume some of that is our role as citizens. What are the policies that will in fact help young women choose life for themselves and their children? So how does the Eucharist push us forward to be helpful? And what are the policies that will help women and children choose life?
Well, John, at the end of the Mass, when I was younger, and I think this is what struck me, one of the final prayers at the end of the liturgy was, let us go and serve the Lord. Let us go in peace and serve the Lord in one another. Some of the priests added on the one another. I don't know if that was liturgically correct, but that's the part that struck me. And today we say, let us go in peace, glorifying the Lord with our life. And as far as the Eucharist is, we need to take it beyond the church. We need to take it to that very idea of bringing it to life. And that's what we do at St. Anne's. We bring the Eucharist to life by serving one another. That's very simplistic, but as you said, I'm not a theologian. Would never try to be, but that's where I think we need to be. What can we do to help families? Well, that's a very, very good question, and that's an easy one to answer. There are many policies that we saw, not even policies, many programs were developed during COVID and even before the period of COVID. And during the time from March 20th until today, we've seen 17 families leave St. Anne's and transition into their own permanent, safe, stable housing. And how did that happen? We're all wondering. We know our services were very comprehensive, but at the same time, we know that we have a federal homeless runaway youth program or grant from the federal government. We have early Head Start. We need more early Head Start for women. We need more affordable childcare. We need childcare in general. Everybody's experiencing that problem right now. We need more housing vouchers so that families who are working in the very lowest pay grades can afford an apartment, can afford some kind of decent, safe housing for themselves. And food stamps, stimulus money helped our families. We have families who were getting the child and still are getting the child tax credit. And that tax credit has helped tremendously. These are things that shouldn't be called entitlements, because that means it sounds like they're their handouts and that people are expecting them. But these are things that the Eucharist, if we're speaking of a Eucharist, would call us to demand.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions. Somebody said, I thought this was about the meeting of Biden with the Pope. And my response is you should have tuned in earlier. But there are questions for Chris on what was surprising about the meeting between President Biden and the Holy Father and what was not. How was this alike other meetings and how was it different? And then a question, shouldn't public officials be held to account as Catholics for their policies that differ with Catholic teaching? Maybe not communion, withholding communion shouldn't be done, but how, in fact, do we hold politicians accountable? The President Biden, who has abandoned his support for the Hyde Amendment, for example, the governor of Texas, who is involved directly in the execution of prisoners. Shouldn't we? What are the ways we hold people account if it's not communion? And then let's go back to Chris on sort of what was new and what was not about the visit. Gloria, how do we hold people accountable?
Well, I would say we are holding all politicians accountable by how we vote, right? I mean, if we don't agree with the policies and things like that, we vote them out of office, we lobby, we do all of those things. And I would think that that's across the board, regardless of the politician's faith background or lack thereof, that we as Catholics raise our voice in the public square in that regard. I think Sister Mary mentioned some wonderful policies that we need to, really push our elected officials about. But can I also add this? I would like to ask every bishop to make sure what are their policies and practices and procedures in the diocese that actually enable us to live as we say we're supposed to live. We have these beautiful teachings on marriage, family, children. How are our policies and how do we operate in a way that allows each and every employee to actually live that out in accordance with what we say we believe? So I would also think that we need to have if the word is right, I don't know if I'm going to say revolution, but we need to have an examination of our own diocese in the United States to see how our own policies and practices actually are or enable people to live in a way that is Eucharistically coherent, and that includes the bishops. So that would be one thing I would suggest also, if we're going to be examining things or holding people accountable, I guess.
Chris, how was this like other meetings and different?
Well, this is a conversation about missing voices in the communion debates. And the one voice that has not been missed is, the discussion around Joe Biden. So that has sucked up all the oxygen in these discussions. So I don't want to spend too much time feeding the beast, if you will. But what I will say about the meeting is that, look, what was not surprising to me was the fact that the statements that were that came from the White House and the Vatican were pretty, formulaic. We knew that's pretty much what we were going to get from them. But the two surprises, I would say, was just the length of the meeting. I mean, there was this, we're waiting to find out when this meeting was going to end. And it just, it kept going on and on and on. And then when we finally got the report that they had been in there together for about 90 minutes, 75 minutes one-on-one, I think everyone, even the most senior veteran folks here on the Vatican beat were just really mystified by how much time they had spent together. And then, of course, the other sort of surprise was a few hours later when Biden, just basically says, yes, the Pope told me to keep receiving communion. That's the story that made headlines all weekend. It's on the front page of, I've got all the Italian papers here right in front of me. And it's, part of the headline on all the papers here. So that's certainly what made the news around here.
Let me ask Sister Mary and Carmen. One question is, how could our bishops behave more like pastors? They think they sometimes come across as more political, as somebody who worked for the bishops. I'm glad they weigh in on the immigration, family leave, Gloria mentioned, and those sorts of things, and abortion. But part of the message is when they do that, do they complicate their role as pastors? What would a pastoral approach to this be? Mary and then Carmen.
Well, it's hard to stay out of politics, but as Gloria was mentioning, there's other ways to influence and be pastoral. And I think by promoting works and efforts to better the lives of people, whether it's those who are desperately poor, the immigrant, or the average American whose lives are very disrupted, or where there's suffering in families, alcoholism or drug addiction or mental health or a breakdown in a marriage, responding that way rather than getting, and responding in a way that people understand. We don't need to hear theological talk. It has to be something that we can understand, that the average person can understand and can feel.
It sounds like you're saying we need a little bit of hope in dark times.
Yeah, we need hope, but we need it to be communicated in a way that is very real.
Yeah. Sister said we don't need theology, but I don't think she was talking about you, Carmen. We do need theologians who can help us understand what the gospel requires and what leadership looks like. How can leadership be both pastoral and prophetic?
Considering how much theologians get paid, I might agree with Sister Mary that it's not exactly a priority. I think one of the best pastors and theologians we have as a model today is Pope Francis. And what inevitably happens is precisely because he is pastoral and he is accessible, people don't give him credit for being a theologian. And sadly, that's what happens to a lot of us, especially those of us who come from communities that have been minoritized in the church. So theologians from the ground, African-American theologians, indigenous theologians, LGBTQ theologians, theologians from communities of disabilities speak from the ground. And the question then becomes is who on the ground are the bishops accountable to, and who on the ground are each of us accountable to as theologians and pastors? I think one of the attempts, and I laud Claudia for raising again and ensuring the accountability point. One of the sort of benefits of synodality is it's an attempt to ensure accountability by enabling as many as possible to be at the metaphorical table. And I have to wonder when bishops talk as pastors, they're not coming from above the people, they're coming from as one of the people. And Francis has this great metaphor that gets lost. He says we have to smell like the sheep. He says that to theologians, and he says it to pastors, and he says it to teachers. And what he means is that if we are part of our communities and embedded, like the work, for example, that Sister Mary does, all right, that's an authority that comes from smelling like the sheep, meaning we take the same risk as the sheep. We face the same troubles as the sheep. We get called out like the sheep. It means we put our lives and our words and our hands in service of our community. And I don't think we understand accountability that way. I'm still waiting for accountabilities for COVID. Where's the accountability for the mixed messaging, to borrow an expression that Christopher used before, on vaccination confusion? Will there be Roman Catholics held accountable for deaths because of vaccination confusion and a lack of a consistent and coherent message in keeping with the Eucharist and the love that's supposed to flow from the table into the community? So I think accountability, as Francis lives it and is trying to get us to understand it through synodality. And then let's take a look at how synodality is being practiced in the United States, as some haven't even called people to the metaphorical table, virtually or in person, to begin the important conversations and the listening that must precede the conversations in order for discernment to be fruitful. So in Latino theologies, we always say pastoral y teología de en conjunto. In other words, theology and pastoral are interwoven. Good luck separating the threads.
Thank you for that. Last question, and then I'm going to ask for some advice for us and for the bishops. How do we as Catholic lay people deal with the reality that our voices are rarely present at the decision-making table? It's mostly clerics. Are there concrete ways for our voices to be heard and part of decision-making? I think this relates to what Carmen was talking about with synodality. How do lay people make their voices heard, whether it's on Eucharist, whether it's on synodality, whether it's on the Eucharistic revival, whether it's on coming out of COVID? How do we have our voices heard? Let's lead off with Gloria.
I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about all the things I've done. Actually, I haven't had express permission from anybody to do it. You know what I mean? I think our faith is freeing in that way. Firstly, I think before we do anything, we always have to be rooted in prayer so that these things that we end up doing aren't just acts of power, but everything is in service to Christ. So we need to be rooted in prayer. And then, you know what? Go out and do. There's nothing stopping us from writing articles, from making podcasts, from doing YouTube videos, from going out and actually being involved in the causes that animate our hearts, right? So helping out at a place like St. Anne's, or I'm on the board of a maternity home and pregnancy center in DC called the Northwest Center. There's nothing stopping people from getting involved in these things. There's nothing stopping people from going and lobbying their local representatives, attending school board meetings. We can be very much involved in raising our voices. And I don't need the permission of my pastor to go and do these things as a Catholic who's also active in the public square. So that's the first thing I want to remind people of, is just go do. You don't. We have our baptismal call. That's your permission, really. And the strength to do that is the Eucharist that we go and receive every week when we go to Mass. But let me also add this, that prayer, receiving the Eucharist, and also going to the Sacrament of Reconciliation, because we should be, as much as we are asking everybody else, we should be doing this internal sort of wrestling, if you will, and where we fall short, we should be going to God, asking for his forgiveness and his grace to help us behave in the way that we claim we believe. So there's a lot that we can be doing to raise our voices. And also, let me not have people underestimate the power of practicing what we believe intimately within our families. Loving our whoever God has given us care for, whether it's aging parents, whether it's newborns, whether it's spouses, whether it's siblings. We are in this human family in one way or another, and to be able to live and love and sacrifice for all those around us is another way that we raise our voices. And so I want people to remember that the intimate way in which we love those God puts around us is one of the ways we can raise our voices. It isn't just simply being on some big stage somewhere or something like that. Let's not be deceived about what it means and the power of actually doing and living and raising our voices in our intimate relationships.
Let me conclude by asking for a closing thought. Given where we are now, what's the best path forward, not just for our bishops, but for all of us, as we try and lift up the gift and the call and the challenge of the Eucharist in our lives? Chris, I know you're a reporter, not an advocate. Give us some analysis. What might be the best path forward? And then I'm going to come to Carmen and Mary and Gloria and ask them what they think the best path forward might be. What's your analysis? What's the way forward for the bishops?
Yeah, so thank you for adding the disclaimer that I would have added myself, John, because I don't give advice. I'm not a consultant, but as someone who looks at the global Catholic Church and tries to help make sense of it and report on what's happening, if you want reporters to have a different story to run with and to tell. I would say you've got to expand the focus. Professor Nico Fernandez has mentioned the Synod many times. It's a massive undertaking that Pope Francis has engaged in, trying to give every single person in the Catholic Church and those outside of the Catholic Church a chance to participate and have their say and to participate, to be listened to. If that story isn't told, it's likely because we reporters are kind of being distracted by the fact that the President of the United States is sort of in the crosshairs of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and frankly, that's what kind of gets clicks, and that's what animates conversation. So if you want to hear those things like the Synod or the fight for the comprehensive programming, as Sister Mary rightfully highlighted at the beginning. Those are the other stories that, need to be made. There needs to be room that's made for them to be told.
Sister Mary, best path forward.
Oh, I'm going to be very simplistic. And, the game plan is right in the gospel. And I would suggest that they keep in mind, just like everybody has a mission, they would have a mission statement, and the mission statement is the gospel, Matthew 25 to start with, and stick with that. And perhaps I'm being too simplistic, but that should always be in the back of their minds with every thought, every decision that they're making.
There's only one question at the Last Judgment. What did you do for the least of these? Carmen, what's the path forward?
I think one thing that's been missing is the notion of forming and informing our consciences, and then to understand that to follow your conscience may often have consequences, and that folks invoke their conscience for many reasons. Through the pandemic, we've seen that from everything from anti-masking to anti-vaxxing, but the decision of conscience also means the acceptance of the consequences. Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the consequences. He wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail, and yet he spoke his piece. It does not come without risk. So it would be nice to see if our brother bishops could, to each other, speak their consciences, and perhaps motivate a more collective and affirming approach that listens to the ground and encourages us all.
Gloria.
I think we need to reject this seduction of temporal power. So much of our discussions have been, like you said, John, really distractions when we've been more concerned about a person in power presenting themselves to the Eucharistic table and less about how we ourselves, whether or not we ourselves are worthy, and what it is that motivates us to want to publicly give someone a comeuppance, if you will. And I've just thought, who does this benefit? Who is this serving? Is this serving God or serving the devil? And so I think we need to really be able to reject the trappings of temporal power and wanting to have people in positions of power that we like or that we approve of. And remember that the victory has already been won. And we need to ask ourselves, how are we serving our Lord Jesus Christ? Are we embracing the poverty of Christ? Are we embracing the cross of Christ? Or are we running after things that are really just the glamour of evil that makes us feel upright and holy when it's not? It's all a way to distract us from our actual obligations and duties and the real way of the cross and loving Christ. So that's one of the ways I think is a way forward.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Mary, Sister Mary. Thank you, Carmen. And thank you, Christopher. What Gloria said at the end about rejecting the temptations, and Sister Mary said it's Matthew 25, brought me back to the article that I read from Carmen that began with, if only we had done this, if only we had done this. And I can't help thinking in conclusion, if only we had spent the last year not divided, not fighting over whether the president could go to communion, but lifting up the humanity of the unborn child and the ways to help people in trouble. If only we hadn't debated who should not go to the Eucharist, but invited everybody back to the Eucharist, said, welcome home. If only we had fought to preserve the Hyde Amendment and the child tax credit that Sister Mary talked about, immigrants. If only we could get beyond this and maybe together see how the Eucharist calls us, we could again be one family of faith in all our diversity and try and make a difference. I want to thank our terrific presenters, Chris, who gave us a great summary of what happened just days ago, Professor Nanko Fernandez, Sister Mary Bader, and Gloria Purvis. I want to thank Kim Daniels and Anna Gordon, Anna Misla Gordon. That's not her name, but she's still Anna Misla. She just got married to me. All our friends who helped us on the technical side, and so many people who tuned in on this All Saints Day. More than 1,700 people signed up. This is a conversation that continues in 2 weeks. It'll continue for 2 years. It'll continue for the rest of our lives. How does the Eucharist call us to live the gospel every day? Thank you very much.